If you were to look back at the history of mixed martial arts, anybody would be able to tell you at a glance that Japan and the Japanese were critical in the development of the sport. Mitsuyo Maeda taught judo to the Gracie clan, leading to the development of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Pro wrestlers like Masakatsu Funaki and Sayama Satoru established organizations like Pancrase and Shudo, which were the progenitors to modern MMA. In the Pride era, Japanese MMA blossomed even more, with legends like Kazushi Sakuraba and Takanori Gomi becoming both domestic and international stars, and international fighters like Fedor Emelianenko and Wanderlei Silva becoming recognized as the best pound-for-pound fighters in the world. And of course, the first ever mixed rules fight, which arguably was the first ever MMA fight in history, was between Antonio Inoki and Muhammad Ali, and that took place in Japan. However, in recent years, Japan's presence in the world of mixed martial arts has diminished. Fighters from the United States, Brazil, and the former Soviet republics have taken over the sport. But there have been signs of change. As of the time of me making this video, the former Rizin flyweight and bantamweight champion Kyoji Horiguchi and the former Shudo champion Tatsuro Taira have both entered the top 5 of the UFC rankings. And as was recently announced, Tatsuro Taira will be challenging Joshua Van in Miami at UFC 327 for the UFC Flyweight Championship. And if it is not Taira or Horiguchi who becomes champion, the former Rizin bantamweight champion Manel Kape is in the running to capture the title as well. And headlining UFC 327 over Tatsuro Taira will be the former Rizin light heavyweight champion Yuri Prohaska, who will be fighting for the UFC light heavyweight championship. On the promotional side of things in Japanese MMA, Rizin had 3 shows with over 40,000 attendees in 2025. For comparison, the attendance of UFC 324 was 19,481, or less than half. In Japan, mixed martial arts is coming close to reaching the same levels of popularity as the Pride era. And as Dana White has announced that they're working on plans for a UFC Japan, the Rizin CEO and former president of Pride Fighting Championships, Nobuyuki Sakakibara, is planning to take Rizin abroad to Korea and even potentially the United States. But how did Japanese MMA undergo this kind of comeback? Who are the key fighters and important industry figures? And what is its future looking like? And for most international fans, and even fighters and coaches, Japanese MMA is very difficult to understand due to the language barrier. But well, in this comprehensive guide to modern Japanese MMA, I'll be going over almost every conceivable aspect of the sport in the land of the rising sun. From the modern history of the Japanese MMA scene, to the most important fighters, to all the relevant organizations, to key individuals in the industry, to even the route I would take if I were a fighter trying to compete in Rizin. All of it will be in this video. But anyways, enough with this introductory segment. I have put timestamps in the description, so let's get straight into the content. Part 1. A brief history of modern Japanese MMA. So before I begin explaining modern Japanese MMA, there's a whole lot of context I have to provide. And to start with this context, we need to go all the way back to 2007, the fateful year when Zuffa, the parent company of the UFC, acquired and deactivated Pride Fighting Championships. The downfall of Pride came largely as a result of their deal with Fuji TV being terminated in 2006 due to allegations regarding Pride's connections to organized crime. Most of the fighters who were contracted to Pride were absorbed by the UFC roster and went on to compete in the United States. And furthermore, the president of Pride FC, Nobuyuki Sakakibara, was made to sign a 7-year-long non-compete agreement with Zuffa, barring him from the MMA business. However, as the saying goes, Pride never dies. And just months after the dissolution of Pride, the organizers for Pride, led by the now-defunct promotion's former head of public relations, Keiichi Sasahara, collaborated with executives from the Japanese regional promotion Deep and the Russian organization M1 Global to put on the MMA event Yarennoka on New Year's Eve of 2007. And if you're wondering which event this was the show where Fedor Emelianenko defeated the Korean giant Hongman Choi via armbar. And while this event only did half the attendance of the Pride New Year's show in 2006, the success inspired the former Pride staff to work with Fighting and Entertainment Group, which was the company that organized K1 kickboxing events, to create Pride's successor, Dream. And now, there's a number of reasons why you don't hear about Dream in the same way you do about Pride or even Rizin. And that's because the promotion just fizzled out. And there are a couple of factors that contributed to this outcome. First and foremost, the deep roster of heavyweights and light heavyweights that Pride had, which arguably is still the greatest roster of higher weight class fighters in history, were all absorbed by the UFC or Strikeforce. And even when Dream was able to bring over fighters like Fedor Emelianenko, it was after he had lost his luster by going on that 3-fight finish loss streak in Strikeforce. So all of the huge main eventers from the Pride era were gone. And back in this age, there was the perception that the best fights were the biggest fights in the heaviest weight classes. And second, the Japanese fighters who Dream tried to develop into stars simply did not become big enough. The former UFC, Pride, Rizin, and Dream fighter Tatsuya Kawajiri blamed himself for the collapse of Dream as a promotion in a 2017 interview with the journalist John Saito, taking responsibility for not having enough star power to carry the promotion. Shinya Aoki, whom Dream was trying to build up as Japan's greatest lightweight talent, also came up short in a number of places. First, while Aoki was very dominant within Japan, even submitting the future UFC champion Eddie Alvarez on New Year's Eve in 2008, he came up short against international competition multiple times, losing a dominant decision against Gilbert Melendez for the Strikeforce lightweight title, and getting KO'd by Eddie Alvarez when they rematched in Bellator. And the other problem with pushing Shinya Aoki as the major attraction of Dream was that his personality wasn't conducive to becoming a star, especially not in Japan. Shinya Aoki is a quirky character, but he isn't exactly the kind of person who can serve as the main hero of your promotion. Case in point, flipping your opponent off and dancing off backstage after breaking his arm isn't going to get you many fans in a country where respect between fighters is the cultural norm. The contrast is especially stark when you compare him to other Japanese stars. Kazushi Sakuraba was incredibly cool because he fought and beat the Gracie clan on their own terms, and then went on to challenge men far bigger and stronger than himself like Wanderlei Silva, Kevin Randleman, Mirko Cro Cop, and Rampage Jackson, and actually win some of those fights. Kid Yamamoto, who was K1's big MMA star and a mentor to Koji Horiguchi, had an explosive striking style and a unique bad boy aesthetic with his tattoos, and I think we can agree that he still has the best fight shorts in MMA history. Shinya Aoki, with his pure grappling fight style and contrarian personality, wasn't exactly a good fit for the majority of Japanese fans. As a consequence of this lack of star power to sell tickets and get TV ratings, Dream was plagued with financial problems, leading to many fighters like Nick Diaz, Joseph Benavidez, Jacare Souza, and even Kazushi Sakuraba himself not getting their fight purses. The lack of fan support and ratings resulted in TBS, which was Dream's TV broadcasting partner, dropping them in 2010. This led to Dream putting on fewer and smaller shows, with certain events like Dream Fight for Japan in 2011 at the Saitama Super Arena, headlined by Imanari Masakatsu, who is the creator of the Minari rule, by the way, and Kenji Osawa, only having an attendance of 6,500. And just for reference, the Saitama Super Arena seats well over 40,000 people, so you can tell Dream was really struggling here. And well, as a consequence of these problems, the parent company for Dream, FSG, declared bankruptcy in 2012. And from here, what is known as Nihon Kakutogi Fuyu no Jidai, or the Winter Age of Japanese MMA, truly began. Japan's biggest names like Shinya Aoki, Kid Yamamoto, and Tatsuya Kawajiri went on to compete in the UFC and won championship. And fighters who weren't fortunate or strong enough to make it to the world stage ended up having to compete on the Japanese regional scene, which itself was having trouble drawing fans. For around 3 to 5 years, Japanese MMA was as good as dead. Fans weren't watching. Fighters were either retiring or competing in front of a few dozen diehards in tiny venues. But then, one man, now free from his 7-year non-compete agreement, returned to the MMA scene. In 2015, Nobuyuki Sakakibara announced that a new fight promotion, dubbed Rizin Fighting Federation, would be putting on an event for New Year's on December 29th and December 31st. The first Rizin event had a combination of old Pride legends like Kazushi Sakuraba and Fedor Emelianenko, as well as dream fighters like Shinya Aoki. And well, this event was a moderate success, getting an attendance of 12,214 on December 29th and 18,365 on December 31st. However, this show was more or less a nostalgia fest, getting to see old legends like Sakuraba and Fedor compete on the big stage for what may be the last time. However, Rizin did not have to rely on nostalgia for long, because unlike Dream, Rizin's early undercards were stacked with fighters who would go on to become megastars in their own right. And here, I'm talking about fighters like Yuri Prohaska, who became the Rizin light heavyweight champion, Kyoji Horiguchi, who completely took over Rizin's lower weight classes, Tenshin Nasukawa, the undefeated kickboxing prodigy, and Rena, a women's shootboxing champion with KO power in every limb, who also happened to be cute and ultra charismatic. These fighters were the complete package. Cool styles, fun personalities, and they also happened to be world-class fighters and true martial artists. However, even with these talents, Rizin struggled to reach the same heights as Pride. And that continued until the rise of two men, the Asakura brothers. Now, for most of you guys who are watching my channel, it is likely very difficult to comprehend the star power of Mikuru and Kai Asakura. However, all you really need to know is that the Asakuras are so famous in Japan that the UFC gave Kai Asakura, the less famous of the two, an immediate title shot in his UFC debut against Alexander Pantoja. Now, summarizing the factors that led to Mikuru and Kai Asakura becoming the stars they are today is difficult, but if I were to nail it down to one key element, it would be this. The Asakura brothers were not traditional martial artists, or at least not martial artists in the way that the Japanese traditionally think of martial artists. In Japanese martial arts and combat sports, fighters are expected to be humble, disciplined, and engage in minimal, if any, trash talk. Example of this would be Tetsuro Taira and Kyoji Horiguchi, Naoya Inoue in boxing, and Takeru in kickboxing, and even international fighters like Yuri Prohaska fit into this mold. There's an expectation to be gentlemanly, to embody a warrior spirit, and to be a good role model for children. But the Asakura brothers, and in particular Mikuru Asakura, broke that mold. Whereas most Japanese fighters were training in dojos, Mikuru Asakura spent his early years fighting on the streets, hanging out with thugs, and causing a nuisance. This sort of background for a fighter isn't uncommon in the UFC. Just look at the Diaz brothers or Jorge Masvidal. But it was unheard of in Japan. The Asakuras were the counterculture to traditional Japanese MMA. They were flashy and rough around the edges, and represented the darker underbelly of fighting. Grimy, messy street brawling as opposed to formal and cordial competition. And this is all best encapsulated in Mikuru Asakura's ring name, Rojo no Densetsu, or Legend of the Streets, which calls back to his origins as a delinquent slugging it out on the pavement. In addition to this countercultural aesthetic, the Asakura brothers began building the social media following, and in particular, their YouTube channels. This made them far more relatable to fans than other martial artists, who, as I said earlier, are expected to be quiet, reserved, and humble. And in Mikuru's case in particular, this increased focus on his personality and his charisma led to him developing personal rivalries with his opponents. All of this, of course, was like nitrous oxide for ticket and pay-per-view sales, as fans now no longer wanted to just see the best fight the best. They wanted to see heated rivalries get settled in the ring. And nowadays in Rizin, there are many fights which consist of one of the Asakura brothers' training partners or buddies fighting against the training partner or friend of one of Asakura's rivals. And in many cases, these drama or storyline based fights between lower level guys gets a lot more buzz than title fights between Rizin's actual top fighters. Fighters are not judged solely on their skill, but on their ability to entertain, draw crowds, sell merchandise, and get fans obsessed with them. And as a result, Japanese fighters now have two major paths to take their careers. The first, of course, is to put all of their grit, effort, and determination into making it to the UFC. Most of the fighters who take this path tend to fit the traditional image of a Japanese martial artist. You know, Tetsuro Taira, Kyoji Horiguchi, and Rin Nakamura. And then, the second path is to reach the top of Rizin, from where fighters can build a lot of fan support within the country and become a big domestic star, which in turn can be leveraged for big opportunities abroad. As I said earlier, just look at how the UFC treated Kai Asakura. But as I close out this brief history of modern Japanese MMA, I will say that both Japanese and Japanese fighters, who developed in large part in a very isolated environment, are beginning to break through into the mainstream. When it comes to fighters, Tatsuro Taira and Koji Horiguchi are vying to become the first Japanese UFC champion. And with Rizin, President Sakakibara is aiming to expand Rizin internationally. So while Japanese MMA was trapped in an age of winter for many years, spring has long since arrived. And soon, things may be hot. Blazing hot. Part 2. How Japanese MMA functions today. As I explained there towards the end of the first section, the UFC and Rizin are the two major promotions where the most talented and popular Japanese fighters go. So in this section, I will be exploring how Japanese fighters develop on the regional scene and how they secure contracts with major fight leagues. I will also be going over a new trend where more and more international fighters are wanting to fight in Rizin, which has been caused by factors like the end of Bellator, the restructuring of the PFL, and the shrinkage of One Championship's MMA. From there, I will explain what I personally would do if I was in their position to try and secure a contract with Japan's top promotion. But anyways, let me start with the four major ways that Japanese fighters end up signing with the UFC. The first way is to be directly signed to the UFC after becoming a champion in a regional promotion. This is a pretty uncommon route, with this being the case for Koji Horiguchi's first run in the UFC, and the only recent example being Tatsuro Taira. Both Horiguchi and Taira were signed by the UFC after becoming the Shudo flyweight champion. The second path is to become a Rizin champion. Now, this isn't open to just Japanese fighters, as besides Koji Horiguchi and Kaya Sakura, Manel Kape and Yuri Prohaska were brought to the UFC after winning the Rizin strap. Getting signed to the UFC as a Rizin champion carries the added benefit of almost being guaranteed a ranked opponent in your debut, with Yuri debuting against number 7 ranked Volkan Ozdemir, Manel debuting against number 5 ranked Alexander Pantoja, Koji making his UFC re-debut against number 11 Tegir Ulanbekov, and in the most extreme case, Kaya Sakura getting an immediate title shot against Pantoja. This happens because the UFC assumes that, since Rizin is another major promotion, any champion in the promotion has already been developed to an elite level. And in most cases, they're right. In most cases. The third and most common method for signing with the UFC is by going through the Road to UFC tournament. Now, I know there's probably a few people who don't know what Road to UFC is, so I'll briefly explain. Road to UFC is a tournament for fighters in East Asia, the Indian subcontinent, and recently Oceania to get a contract with the UFC by fighting one another. This lets the UFC hold the fights during times that work best for Asia, allowing more fans from those regions to watch. The four Japanese fighters who have gotten signed to the UFC through the Road to UFC tournament are Rin Nakamura, Toshiyomi Kazama, Rei Tsuruya, and most recently, Keiichiro Nakamura, who won his contract with a comeback KO win over Sebastian Sisley. Many other Japanese fighters like Tatsuya Ando, Jinnosuke Kashimura, and Tatsuya Yamba Osaika have also competed on Road to UFC without making it through the tournament, leading to them getting opportunities with Rizin instead. The fighters who are signed through Road to UFC are all done so as prospects, and while some of those prospects, like Anshul Jubli, who won the first season of Road to UFC at lightweight, disappoint and underperform tremendously, fighters like Rin Nakamura tend to end up doing pretty decently. The fourth and final way a Japanese fighter has for signing with the UFC is, of course, Dana White's Contender Series. And to the surprise of some of you, this is actually the rarest way for Japanese prospects to get into the UFC. Even rarer than becoming Rizin champion. And that is because most of the Japanese fighters who compete on Contender Series are from the higher weight classes like welterweight and middleweight. And well, when you take into consideration that the average male height in Japan is 5'7" or 170 centimeters, you could probably guess that the level of competition on the regional scene at welterweight and above isn't exactly that high. The only Japanese fighter who has won on Dana White's Contender Series is Yusaku Kinoshita, and even though his performance on the show was promising, he was cut from the UFC after going on a 2-fight KO loss streak to Adam Fugit and Billy Ray Goff, neither of whom are really high-level UFC welterweights. But anyways, now that I've gone through all the paths to the UFC from Japan, let's go over all the routes to secure those opportunities by doing a quick overview of the Japanese regional scene. The most well-established regional promotions in Japan are Pancrase, Shuto, and Deep, with all of those promotions also having amateur brackets as well. Now, for many of you old heads out there, I'm sure that when I say Pancrase, You think of legends like Ken Shamrock and Bas Rutten, and that strange rule set where you could only strike with an open palm, and you had to wear boots and all of that. However, Pancrase has shifted its rules to match the modern global standards of MMA, with fighters wearing 4-ounce gloves, fights taking place in a cage, and strikes like knees to the head of a ground-out opponent and soccer kicks being banned. Pancrase is also well known for bringing in international talent from countries like Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Australia, and more to bolster their roster, letting Japanese fighters build experience against tough foreign competition without having to leave the country. In other words, Pancrase is one of the best environments for fighters to develop if they want to fight under the unified rules of MMA. Building a record in Pancrase has helped fighters like Raid Tsuruya and Toshio Mikazama secure spots on Road to UFC, with Raid Tsuruya even becoming the flyweight king of Pancrase. Next, let's talk about Shudo. Shudo is not only the oldest mixed martial arts organization in Japan, but the oldest mixed martial arts organization in the entire world. Over the 40 plus years that Shudo has been operating, many great fighters have developed through the promotion, with notable examples including Kao Uno, Shinya Aoki, Hiromasa Ogikubo, Yutaka Saito, Kyoji Horiguchi, and Tetsuro Taira. Many Shudo champions end up becoming champions in other organizations, with Hiromasa Ogikubo and Yutaka Saito becoming Rizin champions, and Kyoji Horiguchi, of course, winning straps in Rizin and Bellator. However, as of the time of me making this video, Shudo has been struggling a bit due to many fighters wanting to compete in Pancrase or Deep, as those two promotions are drawing more fan attention. And, speaking of Deep, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that Deep is not only the most successful regional promotion in Japan right now, but probably one of the most successful regional leagues in the world. And there are a few reasons why I would say that. First of all, Deep is now consistently selling out all of its shows. And since they're holding events at places like Korakuen Hall, which some of you may be familiar with from the boxing manga Hajime no Ippo, that means that Deep is consistently drawing crowds of anywhere from 1,400 to 2,000 people. For reference, most of the PFL's events outside of the Middle East usually take place in arenas that seat around 4,000 to 5,000 people, and the PFL isn't selling those arenas out like Deep does. Second, you can compare Deep's views on YouTube to those of other promotions. Fights featuring noteworthy prospects like Kazuki Aimoto easily get over 100,000 views on the channel. In contrast, literal title fights like Vadim Nemkov vs Henan Fehea for the PFL Heavyweight Championship are getting 37,000 views in a similar time frame. When it comes to YouTube views, the only fighters in the PFL who consistently outperform Deep's numbers are Usman Nurmagomedov, Paul Hughes, and Sergio Pettis. And I'm going to be honest, I'm pretty sure the PFL is doing something to boost the views on their channel, because the 200,000 plus views they got for the Road to Dubai series for Nurmagomedov versus Davis really makes no sense when you consider that each of these have fewer than 100 comments. And third, Deep currently has, as far as I know, the only active women's-only MMA promotion in the world, which is Deep Jewels. And yes, there technically still is Invicta FC, but Invicta hasn't had an event for over a year, and also is no longer on UFC Fight Pass as of 2021, so it's currently in a bit of a limbo. Fighters from Deep Jewels like Kate Lotus and Suzu Oi regularly get comparable numbers to their male counterparts, with the most popular Jewels fighters getting the call-up to compete in Rizin. Now, there are a variety of reasons why Deep has become the most successful regional league in Japan. First of all, the president of Deep, Shigeru Saeki, who used to work as a promoter for the Pride Bushido series, has a very strong relationship with Rizin, with Saeki regularly being a part of Rizin's broadcasts and events. This means that for many Japanese fighters, the best path to make it to Rizin is by fighting in Deep. Deep's shows also regularly feature fighters who have competed in Rizin in the past, like Shinryu Makoto, and even former champions like Jutaro Ushiku, making Deep a sort of Rizin light, if you catch my drift. Even Deep's rule set is like that of Rizin's, with soccer kicks, stomps, and knees to the head of a ground-out opponent all being legal. However, unlike fighting exclusively in Rizin, fighters from Deep are mostly free to compete in other promotions, most notably Dana White's Contender Series and the Road to UFC tournament, meaning that Deep is the option that gives fighters the most flexibility when it comes to making it to the big leagues. So yes, as of now, it is Deep that sits at the top of the pecking order when it comes to Japanese regional promotions for developing talent. However, there are still other options besides Shudo, Pancrase, and Deep for emerging talent, albeit they do not have as high of a reputation. Notably, there are Fighting Nexus and Grachan, which are typically regarded as having lower levels of competition than the aforementioned Big Three. However, some solid fighters have come from there, with the most notable one being the Road TFC Featherweight Tournament winner Keiichiro Nakamura, who spent his early career in Grachan, so you can't count those two promotions out either. Now, the final big fight promotion that I have to talk about in Japan is very, very different from the others, and that is Breaking Down. Breaking Down is, well, the best way to explain it would be that it's Japanese street beefs. The promotion was founded in 2021 by Mikuru Asakura as a fight promotion for individuals with little to zero combat sports experience, where competitors would face each other in bouts that lasted for only a single 1-minute round. Matchmaking in Breaking Down happens through auditions, where potential contestants are encouraged to sell themselves as personalities to the audition judges. Most of the time, this consists of making fools of themselves or by picking fights with the other contestants by insulting them or even assaulting them. The auditions for Breaking Down, which are posted to Mikuru Asakura's YouTube channel, regularly do millions of views. And as a result, Breaking Down is the best promotion besides Rizin for domestic fame and success, with Breaking Down contestants easily making hundreds of thousands of dollars just off of sponsorships alone. However, Breaking Down is also regarded as the most controversial and lowest level promotion in Japan, with legendary Japanese fighters like Koji Horiguchi and Shinya Aoki voicing their concerns over its practices. Breaking Down gets this criticism for a number of reasons. First of all, as I stated earlier, many fights in Breaking Down take place between completely untrained individuals, many of whom don't know the basics of fighting like keeping your guard up or tucking your chin. This leads to Breaking Down fights mostly consisting of techniqueless brawls that some fighters may believe lower the bar for what is considered martial arts. Second, the auditions for Breaking Down have been criticized as having a negative societal impact, with critics saying that the auditions contribute to bullying among schoolchildren and the glorification of thuggish and criminal behavior. Many of the contestants on Breaking Down have prior criminal records, and in order to sell themselves during the audition process, act in ways that may be seen as unbecoming of a martial artist. Most notably, Breaking Down was the center of massive controversy in December of 2025 when a contestant ambushed his opponent with a slap to the chin at weigh-ins, knocking him out and making the back of his head hit the floor. This assault caused a subarachnoid hemorrhage, leading to the man who was KO'd needing to retire from combat sports. But controversies aside, Breaking Down does incredible numbers within Japan, with some fans exclusively watching Breaking Down and none of the other regional promotions. This has led to Breaking Down fighters like Daichi Tomizawa getting opportunities in Rizin, albeit they tend to fall short much of the time due to the much higher level of competition. But anyways, those are all of the Japanese regional promotions and their quirks, so let's move on to why more and more international fighters are trying to fight in Rizin, and what I personally would do to get a contract with the promotion. And if you're wondering why I'm putting this segment in here, it's because I now know for a fact that some fighters do watch my videos. So yeah, here it goes. Many of you who only watch the UFC may not know this, but the number of MMA promotions and offers for fights is quietly declining. Bellator was absorbed by the PFL, which in turn has done some serious restructuring by having Don Davis step down as chairman and getting rid of the tournament format and switching to a ranking system. One Championship is continuing to struggle financially and has drastically reduced the number of MMA fights on their cards, opting to do mostly Muay Thai and kickboxing in low-cost venues like Lumpini Stadium. This has led to many fighters that were formerly a part of those organizations being signed to Rizin or asking to be signed to Rizin. Notable signings include James Gallagher, who is Conor McGregor's teammate, and Patricky Pitbull from Bellator, and fighters who are requesting for Rizin to sign them include the former Bellator title challenger Jeremy Kennedy and former One Championship flyweight Reese McLaren. And besides these veteran fighters from other major organizations, there are many prospects who are trying to get signed by Rizin. I mean, there was even this 5-0 striker who mistakenly DM'd one of the Rizin ring girls thinking she was the matchmaker. However, a lack of options is not the only reason why Rizin is becoming a sought-after fighting destination. One of the largest reasons why Rizin is becoming so popular with fighters are the fans. Japanese fans are some of the most respectful and passionate in the world, with a great example of this being how the Rizin lightweight champion, Ilkham Nazimov, did an impromptu fan meetup and over 300 people showed up on an hour's notice, leading to the police having to be called to keep things under control. Other fighters like Rizin bantamweight champion Danny Sabatello and Rizin flyweight Jose Shorty Torres have also spoken at length about how nice the interactions with fans are. And well, fighters talk to each other basically every day since they train together. So when Japan gets a reputation as a great place to fight, that becomes common knowledge quite quickly. And besides, what fighter would pass up the opportunity to fight in front of 40,000 people? Now, if I were a fighter who wanted to get a fight in Rizin, here is what I would do. First, there is one thing that you need. An absolute must. Something that is more important than being an exciting fighter or a highly technical savant or a physical beast. And that is having an X account. I'm serious. Having X, or Twitter as it's still sometimes called, is crucial for fighting in Japan. And that is because most MMA discourse in Japan takes place on that platform. And I can summarize how important Twitter is in Japanese MMA with a single story. So you remember Ilkham Nazimov, the Rizin lightweight champion who had the fan meeting? Well, he originally wasn't supposed to be on the card where he won the title. He had fought in Rizin a few times before, but that was all down at featherweight. However, Ilkham Nazimov had built a small but very vocal following of fans on X by having a Japanese social media manager tweet in Japanese. This led to fans spamming Rizin's social media with cries of, "We want to see Nazimov," and "When are we seeing Nazimov?" and all of that. This led to him getting an opportunity against an American kickboxer called Noah Bay up at lightweight on New Year's Eve. However, the guy who was originally supposed to challenge for the lightweight title got injured, which led to Ilkham Nazimov stepping up as a replacement against the champion Roberto Satoshi Souza. And well, Nazimov ended up sleeping Souza with a perfectly timed knee up the middle, leading to him winning the title. So, basically, this guy Nazimov became the champion because he tweeted a lot. So yeah, get on Elon Musk's echo chamber of a social media service because it's pretty damn important for Japanese MMA. And then just start calling guys out and promoting yourself. In Rizin, showing that you want to fight is appreciated by both the fans and the company, as it leads to your personality as a fighter becoming more and more well known, making you a bigger potential draw. While he may be a Japanese fighter, the best example of this is Ren Hiramoto, who went on a vicious social media campaign against Mikuru Asakura, leading to him getting a main event opportunity to fight Mikuru, where he would proceed to knock Mikuru out and become one of the biggest stars in Rizin himself. Rizin is a promotion that really rewards self-promotion, probably more so than any other fight league in the world. So marketing oneself, whether as a babyface or as a heel or even just as a plain weirdo, you will increase your chances at not only getting fights, but getting big fights. Title fights even. But anyways, that is about it regarding how modern Japanese MMA works. Now, of course, I could talk for probably another extra hour or so about the nitty-gritty details, like which management companies are good to sign with, and what sort of style of self-promotion you want to take, depending upon your personality, but that would make this video way too long, and it's long enough already. So let's move on and get into the talk about all the fighters you need to know. Part 3. Noteworthy fighters in modern Japanese MMA. So in this section, I'll be briefly introducing all of the most important fighters in Japanese MMA. I'll be doing this all by weight class, starting from flyweight and going upwards, because it is easier format-wise. So starting with the legend himself, let's talk about Kyoji Horiguchi. Now, if you've clicked on this video, you definitely already know who Kyoji Horiguchi is. Horiguchi is a former Shudo, Bellator, and Rizin champion, a former UFC title challenger against Demetrius Johnson, and is currently a top-ranked contender in the UFC after coming back to the promotion after 9 years fighting in Bellator and Rizin. As you may have inferred from his fighting style and nickname, Kyoji Horiguchi's background is in traditional karate, which he started practicing at 5 years old. When Kyoji Horiguchi was a teenager, he watched Pride and K1, and in particular became a big fan and admirer of the K1 legend Kid Yamamoto, inspiring him to take up MMA. This led to Kyoji becoming a student of Kid Yamamoto's at the gym Crazy B. From there, Kyoji Horiguchi would rapidly climb through the local scene, becoming a Shudo champion and eventually signing with the UFC. Kyoji Horiguchi tore through the UFC flyweight rankings, amassing a 4-fight win streak before being put into a title fight against Demetrius Johnson, which he would lose by submission at 4 minutes and 59 seconds into the 5th round. Following this loss, and with Kid Yamamoto's full understanding and support, Kyoji Horiguchi made the move to switch gyms and train full-time at American Top Team, where he has trained ever since. From that point on, Kyoji would continue to win in the UFC, but ended up not re-signing with the promotion due to the UFC's plans to shut down the flyweight division in the mid to late 2010s, which resulted in Kyoji making the jump over to Rizin. In Rizin, Kyoji Horiguchi would amass a resume of quality names. Kyoji's wins outside of the UFC include Manel Kape, Sergio Pettis, Hiromasa Ogikubo, Ian McCall, Kai Asakura, Yuki Motoya, Makoto Shinryu, and Nkazimulo Zulu. Kyoji also defeated Darian Caldwell, the reigning Bellator bantamweight champion, twice, leading to him capturing the strap despite being a natural flyweight. Kyoji Horiguchi also faced off in kickboxing against the kickboxing prodigy Tenshin Nasukawa, and put up a really good fight despite being out of his element. All of these accomplishments have led to Kyoji Horiguchi being called Shijou Saikyo no Meido in Japan, or the strongest made-in-Japan fighter in history, which is pretty ironic considering that he trains at American Top Team. As for interesting trivia about Kyoji Horiguchi, he's married to Natsuki Karamura, an actress and beauty YouTuber who he proposed to in the Rizin ring after choking out Makoto Shinryu in New Year's of 2023. In addition to her own work, she helps Kyoji Horiguchi run his YouTube channel. Also, apparently, Kyoji Horiguchi knows about my channel because Mauricio Gomez, a fighter who watches my channel and trains at ATT, has told him about it, which, well, is really cool to say the least. But anyways, moving on, next we have Tatsuro Taira. So, funnily enough, Tatsuro Taira is actually probably more popular outside of Japan than he is inside, and that is because instead of fighting in Rizin like Kyoji Horiguchi and Kai Asakura did, Tatsuro Taira went straight to the UFC from Shudo. But just to explain his background, Tatsuro Taira was born and raised in Okinawa, an island prefecture with a distinct culture that is very different from mainland Japan. Growing up, Tatsuro Taira played baseball, but got tired of the sport after a while. While Tatsuro was in high school, he was introduced to MMA by his brother, who was taking kickboxing classes at the gym The Palestra Okinawa, which would later on be rebranded to the Black Belt Japan Okinawa. Under the tutelage of his head coach, Rota Matsune, Tatsuro Taira took naturally to mixed martial arts, amassing a record of 9-0 in Shudo, including a submission win over Ryuya Fukuda, who is a fighter I will be talking about later on once I get to the notable bantamweights in Japanese MMA. Being an undefeated prospect, Tatsuro Taira received offers from both Rizin and from One Championship. However, Rota Matsune guided Taira, saying that he could fight, win, and become a champion in the UFC, which led to him signing with the UFC in 2022. From there, Tatsuro Taira would claw through the UFC rankings, losing only to Brandon Royval in a close split decision during his run. Nowadays, Tatsuro Taira splits his time between training in Japan and training in Colorado with the likes of Justin Gaethje and Corey Sandhagen under Trevor Whitman, where he is improving his striking. But anyways, moving on to the final Japanese flyweight in the UFC, let's talk about Rei Tsuruya. Rei Tsuruya is a former flyweight king of Pancrase and the Season 2 Road to UFC flyweight tournament winner. Rei Tsuruya's father, Hiroshi Tsuruya, is the founder and head coach of the Black Belt Japan, a network of gyms that includes Tatsuro Taira's home gym in Okinawa. Hiroshi Tsuruya also was Rota Matsune's coach when Matsune was competing as a professional fighter. Rei Tsuruya began wrestling at 3 years old and won numerous wrestling accolades both within Japan and internationally while in middle and high school. His original goal was to win a gold medal in the Olympics, but his goal changed to becoming a UFC champion after watching Conor McGregor KO Chad Mendes for the interim featherweight title. However, Hiroshi stopped Rei from pursuing MMA full-time while still in high school, so Rei continued to wrestle in high school and train MMA in his spare time. Rei Tsuruya's style is built around his wrestling and top pressure, with his only professional loss coming at the hands of the UFC flyweight champion Joshua Van. Although Rei Tsuruya trains most of the time in Japan at his father's gym, he has been going abroad to train at Fight Ready MMA under the tutelage of Henry Cejudo to improve his striking. And now, moving on to the Rizin flyweight champion, let's talk about Hiromasa Ogikubo. Hiromasa Ogikubo, who also trains under Hiroshi Tsuruya at the Black Belt Japan, is one of the best flyweights to have never competed in the UFC, having amassed over 30 wins in his professional career. In addition to being the Rizin flyweight champion, Hiromasa Ogikubo is a former Shudo champion and the Rizin 2021 Bantamweight Grand Prix winner, with wins over Kaya Sakura, John Dodson, Yuki Motoya, Jose Shorty Torres, and, most impressively, Alexander Pantoja, who Ogikubo outclassed over 3 rounds on the 24th season of The Ultimate Fighter. He also recently out-wrestled and dominated an undefeated Dagestani prospect in Alibek Gajmadov in the semifinals of the Rizin Flyweight Grand Prix, which should tell you the level of wrestling he's at. Despite having a backbone in Kyokushin Karate, Hiromasa Ogikubo is most well known for his wrestling pressure and top game. Hiromasa's decision-heavy style has led to him being criticized for being boring, with him not getting signed to the UFC like Pantoja and Moreno did after the 24th season of The Ultimate Fighter, despite having done better than them in the tournament. In Japan, his fights are often called shio, or salty, due to how he wrestles to win. However, Hiromasa Ogikubo has embraced being a salty fighter, even selling his own line of table salt. This has led to fans embracing him and his fight style in a sort of irony-laden way. Hiromasa Ogikubo is also considered to be the head chairman of the Kyoji Horiguchi Victims Committee, having lost 3 times to Kyoji, once in Shudo and twice in Rizin. But anyways, let's now move on to a very distinctly Japanese MMA fighter, the Rizin flyweight Hiroya Kondo. Hiroya is an interesting fighter because, despite having a negative record at 11-15, he's likely the most popular flyweight in Rizin today, and is probably the second most popular flyweight in Japan after Kyoji Horiguchi himself. Hiroya was born in Hyogo Prefecture and competed on the regional scene there during his early pro career, amassing a record of 3 wins, 4 losses, and 1 draw before moving to Tokyo to train under Mikuru Asakura, who's doing a YouTube series called the Mikuru Asakura 1-Year Challenge, where Asakura would personally sponsor and train young men who wanted to make a living through mixed martial arts. Mikuru's platform helped Hiroya become a household name among the Japanese MMA fanbase while he competed in promotions like Deep and Breaking Down. Hiroya's enduring personality and ability to draw a crowd led to him getting opportunities in Rizin, including a spot in the 2025 Rizin Flyweight Grand Prix. While Hiroya trains most of the time at Mikuru and Kaya Sakura's gym, Japan Top Team, he also spends many of his training camps in the United States in Las Vegas at the UFC Performance Institute, where he trains under Billy Bigelow, who is the wrestling and strength and conditioning coach for Cody Garbrandt and Alex Perez, and the former coach of Kaya Sakura. And now, the final flyweight who I would like for you guys to know about is Yuki Motoya, a Rizin flyweight and former bantamweight who has the accolade of being the fighter with the most bouts in Rizin, where he has fought a staggering 24 times. Yuki Motoya, who trains alongside Kyoji Horiguchi at American Top Team, has been competing in Rizin for over a decade, with wins over fighters like Makoto Shinryu, Kilma Akimoto, and the current UFC flyweight Alan Nascimento. While Motoya has lost to the likes of Kyoji Horiguchi, Hiromasa Ogikubo, Kaya Sakura, and Patchy Mix, he is a Rizin staple and one of the most revered veterans in the promotion. And now, while I could keep going on and on about more flyweights since it's Japan's deepest division, but I need to keep the pace of this video going, so let's move on to the 135ers. Now, at 135, the biggest name in Japanese MMA has to be Kai Asakura. And while Kai Asakura has lost twice in the UFC at flyweight, leading to me undergoing bouts of deep depression, he was killing himself to make weight, and he will be competing at bantamweight from this point on. As you are all likely aware, Kai Asakura is a former 2-time Rizin bantamweight champion, with wins over Kyoji Horiguchi, Manel Cape, Juan Archuleta, Yuki Motoya, and Hiromasa Ogikubo, and is known for being one of the hardest hitters at the lower weight classes. Born in Aichi Prefecture, Kai Asakura trained karate and sumo at a young age along with his brother Mikuru. But unlike Mikuru, who was out there on the streets brawling and getting into trouble, Kai spent most of his school years playing volleyball, only fighting when provoked. However, after being dragged out to spar on the streets by Mikuru, Kai Asakura took up martial arts as a full-time endeavor. While fighting, Kai built his YouTube following along with Mikuru, becoming a huge draw for Rizin and later on for the UFC, as even though Kai has lost twice in the UFC now, rumor on the street is that he is the biggest draw for the UFC in Japan. But anyways, moving on from Kai Asakura, let's talk about the Rizin bantamweight champion, Danny Sabatello. A former Titan FC champion and Bellator fighter training out of American Top Team, Danny Sabatello has quickly become one of the biggest names in Rizin due to his distinct look, trash talk, and wrestling prowess. And while some of you who used to watch him in Bellator may be baffled at how Sabatello has become a fan favorite in Japan because of his lay and pray fight style, there's a couple interesting reasons why he's grown on the Rizin fans. First, all of the fans know that Danny Sabatello's trash talk is all fake. They know it's all just a persona he does to try and hype up his fights, which is sort of weirdly endearing. And second, Danny Sabatello has genuinely become a much more entertaining fighter while in Rizin, beating up the Greco-Roman wrestling Olympic silver medalist Shinobu Ota on the feet before KOing him out cold with a reverse slam, and throwing soccer kicks to the face during his title-winning performance against Naoki Inoue. And third, well, he's a good-looking Italian-American guy, and there are a lot of female Japanese MMA fans, so I wouldn't be surprised if he's getting some attention from them as well. And now, moving on to the man who Sabatello beat for the bantamweight strap, there's Naoki Inoue. Naoki Inoue, not to be confused with the boxing legend Naoya Inoue, is a mixed martial artist and Rizin fighter who holds the distinction of being the youngest ever Japanese fighter to have fought in the UFC, where he fought twice at just 19 years old. Like many other Japanese fighters, Naoki's backbone is in karate, and he has trained abroad at gyms like Serra-Longo Fight Team and Killcliff FC in the past. Naoki Inoue is known for having a very calm and introverted personality, and while he isn't the most popular Japanese fighter, he is definitely very skilled, having exceptional range management with his straight punches. One other point of note is that Naoki Inoue's sister, Mizuki Inoue, is currently the number 15th ranked women's strawweight in the UFC. Next, there's Rinya Nakamura. Rinya Nakamura is a UFC bantamweight training at American Top Team alongside Koji, and was the 2017 U23 Freestyle Wrestling World Champion before retiring to pursue mixed martial arts. He is also the winner of the first Road to UFC bantamweight tournament, KOing fellow finalist and Japanese fighter Toshiomi Kazama to win his contract. And well, besides all of that, you guys might remember Rinya Nakamura for one other thing.
Yeah, how are you going to celebrate here in Vegas? What are you going to do?
The actually only way that I know celebrating in this city is gamble.
Gambo.
Gamble.
Really? Gambo. Roulette, slot. Yeah, blackjack.
Gamble. I learned Baccarat this week, so...
Uh-oh.
Baccarat. Yeah, it's very fun. Gamble.
Wish me luck.
Yeah, Gamber. Lots of Gamber. But anyways, moving on to the final bantamweight I want to talk about, is Ryuya Fukuda. Ryuya Fukuda is a former Shudo and Deep Flyweight champion and the current Deep Bantamweight champion, and holds the distinction of having been the first fighter to win titles at 2 different weight classes in Deep. Ryuya Fukuda is a southpaw striker with wins over fighters like the former Road to UFC contestant Tatsuya Ando and the former Rizin featherweight champion Juntaro Ushku, and holding a record of over 25 pro wins, he is probably the most underrated name on Tatsuro Taira's resume, as Taira submitted Fukuda with a triangle choke in the first round. But anyways, those are all of the bantamweights I wanted to talk about, so let's move on to the division with the most names I need to talk about, which is 145 pounds. And at featherweight, the biggest and most significant name I need to talk about is Mikuru Asakura. And while I already explained part of his story and appeal as a fighter and personality in the history section of this video, but here I will talk about his rise and the contributions he has made to the sport. Mikuru was born in Aichi Prefecture and spent most of his youth causing trouble as a delinquent, even getting sent to a juvenile detention center for a year and a half for reckless driving without a license. Knowing that he had to make a change in his life, Mikuru began competing in the promotion The Outsider, which is a now defunct MMA promotion with a very specific goal of rehabilitating delinquent youth through mixed martial arts. Mikuru became a 2-division champion in The Outsider and went on to compete in promotions like Road FC and Deep before getting the call up to Rizin in 2018 to fight the former UFC fighter Hatsuhi Hioki. Mikuru capitalized on this opportunity by scoring a highlight reel head kick KO against Hioki. And in the same year, Mikuru started his YouTube channel. And here, Mikuru started an incredibly popular series called Kenkajiman vs. Mikuru Asakura, with Kenkajiman translating to men who brag about being good at brawling, or thereabouts. In this series, Mikuru would record himself sparring against self-described street fighters and brawlers, beating them to a pulp. And these videos went insanely viral, with some of them garnering tens of millions of views. And the concept of having street fighters and brawlers fight each other ended up becoming the basis for the promotion breaking down. Mikuru's virality and talent as a fighter led to him consistently receiving offers from Rizin, leading to him amassing a 7-fight win streak in the promotion. This resulted in Mikuru being given a title shot against the former Shudo champion Yutaka Saito for the inaugural Rizin featherweight title, which he would lose in a close decision. However, Mikuru's star power continued to be unmatched, even though he has never been a Rizin champion despite having fought for the featherweight title a total of 3 times. Mikuru is such a big star that his non-title bouts are put above title bouts, which is what happened at Super Rizin 4. And throughout his career, Mikuru has defeated multiple former Rizin champions, including Juntaro Ushiku, Chihiro Suzuki, Kleber Koike-Herbst, and Yutaka Saito, with the latter 2 names being fights he won rematches against. And nowadays, being a part of Mikuru Asakura's circle is a ticket to fame and financial success in mixed martial arts, with fans even coming up with the term the Asakura Economic Zone to describe fighters and media personalities who make a living by being close to him or by talking about his fights. Mikuru Asakura is also known for having many fans who vicariously lived through him, and was the main driver behind Rizin selling 40,000 plus tickets for venues like the Saitama Super Arena and the Tokyo Dome. But anyways, I could make an entire video going over just Mikuru Asakura, so let's move on to a former opponent of Mikuru's and the current Rizin featherweight champion, Rajabali Shade As of the time of me making this video, Rajabali Shade is 18-0 with a 100% finish rate and has never seen the 3rd round throughout his entire pro career. Rajabali is considered by most media outlets to be the best featherweight outside of the UFC due to his wins over fighters like the former Bellator champion Juan Archuleta, the KSW and Rizin champion Kleber Koike, the former K1 welterweight champion Yuta Kubo, the 25-4 Russian Viktor Kolesnik, and Mikuru Asakura. Currently, Rizin is having significant trouble finding opponents who could take Shade alive to the 2nd round, let alone to decision. And it will likely not be long until he makes the move to the UFC. So now you can be happy knowing they have some elite ball knowledge to flex over your friends once he goes there and becomes a big deal like Yuri Prohaska or Manel Kape. But anyways, let's now move on to a potential future opponent of Rajabali Shade, the Japanese prospect Kyoma Akimoto. Even though he is only 20 years old this year, Kyoma Akimoto is regarded as one of the top prospects in Japan, already having over 10 wins as a pro. Kyoma Akimoto trains at Japan Top Team along with the Asakura brothers, and has already been selected to be the main event for Rizin shows like Rizin Landmark 12 and Rizin 52. Although he is very early on in his career, Rizin is in the process of growing Kyoma as one of their top stars, as his student-master relationship with Mikuru makes him very marketable as Mikuru's successor. And now moving on to another big star, let's talk about Ren Hiramoto. Ren Hiramoto is a former K1 kickboxer who transitioned to MMA, and is regarded as Mikuru Asakura's greatest rival. He is also technically the Rizin Last Man Standing champion, which is basically Rizin's version of the BMF belt. Ren Hiramoto won the Last Man Standing title by KOing Mikuru Asakura at Super Rizin 3, a matchup he was able to get through an elaborate trash-talking campaign which he waged against Mikuru over the course of years. And after his win over Mikuru, Ren Hiramoto became the center of controversy due to allegations of steroid and SARMs use leading up to the fight, including leaked phone calls and bank transfers for the purchase of these substances. However, Ren's drug test came back clean, so the KO win over Mikuru has remained on his record. Besides that, Ren has remained inactive due to injuries since his win over Mikuru, and he has a past of training in Ireland at SBG Ireland alongside his idol, Conor McGregor. And yes, it would be fair to say that Ren is a bit of an edgelord. However, that is precisely why he sells fights. Moving on, the final featherweight I want to talk about here is Chihiro Suzuki. Chihiro Suzuki is a former Rizin featherweight champion and a former knockout kickboxing champion with a win over Yuki Oza, which, if you follow kickboxing, you would know is a pretty damn big deal. Chihiro Suzuki is known for his wild swang and bang fight style, where he throws hooks and overhands with full force and no caution for his own personal safety. The best example of Chihiro's KO power was his short notice fight against the Bellator legend and current UFC featherweight contender Patricio Pitbull, where Chihiro became the first and only fighter to ever KO Patricio. However, Chihiro is currently on a 3-fight loss streak, which is caused in part by him fighting while injured, with his Rizin return being somewhat uncertain due to said lingering injuries. Now, let's move on to the lightweight division. And currently at lightweight, there aren't any standout Japanese stars, so I'll just get started by talking about the Rizin lightweight champion, the Uzbekistani Ilkham Nazimov. Now, I've already spoke at length about Ilkham and how he became the champion by tweeting in the segment about how Japanese MMA works, so I guess I'll just go over a few other reasons why Ilkham is liked so much. In addition to being on Twitter, Nazimov enjoys eating tuna mayo rice balls, which is endearing to the Japanese because he likes something they like. He also plays Dota 2, and in some ways is culturally closer to a Russian than an Uzbekistani. Who knows, if he's a Russian internet user, maybe he's a fan of gachi like the Japanese too. And if that's the case, Nazimov, I will glaze you for the rest of your life. But anyways, moving on to the fighter who Ilkham Nazimov KO'd to win the belt, let's talk about Roberto Satoshi Souza. Roberto Satoshi Souza is a Brazilian with Japanese roots, and was the first ever Rizin lightweight champion. The narrative of the Rizin lightweight division was defined by Satoshi's dominance, with him repeatedly clearing out the division with wins over fighters like Yoshinori Horie, Luis Gustavo, and the current UFC fighter Tofik Masayev. The sheer dominance of his BJJ offense led to him being regarded as one of the best lightweights outside of the UFC. But now that he's lost the belt for the first time in his career in a first-round upset KO win, his future remains somewhat uncertain. The final lightweight I want to briefly bring up is Taisei Sakuraba, who is the son of the legendary Kazushi Sakuraba. Much like his father before him, Taisei Sakuraba's main strength is his grappling prowess, but he can also strike pretty decently as well, with his MMA debut being a KO win over Yachi Yusuke, who was 27 and 14 at the time and had experience fighting Volkanovski back on the regional scene. So yeah, it is kind of cool that the Sakuraba lineage is continuing. Since Kron Gracie has been released from the UFC, we may one day end up seeing Gracie versus Sakuraba once again in Japan. Now at this point, I want to introduce a few fighters of note that don't fit into the 4 weight classes I mentioned earlier. Starting with the Rizin Super Atomweight champion, there's Seika Izawa. So women's atomweight, or as it's called in Rizin, Super Atomweight, is a division that doesn't exist in the UFC, but does in promotions like Rizin, Invicta, and ONE FC. Seika Izawa is the number 1 ranked fighter in the world at this division, boasting a record of 18 wins and 0 losses. And as a result, the current storyline of Rizin's Super Atomweight division is similar to that of the featherweight division and Shadalayev. Basically, who can beat this woman? And if you're wondering if she'll go to the UFC, she most likely won't due to being too undersized for strawweight. 2 other women's atomweights who are worth a shout out are Rana and Kate Lotus, both of whom are more popular than the champion actually. And yes, it is because they are attractive. Although in Rena's case, she also was the fighter who first popularized women's MMA and the atomweight division back in the earlier days of Rizin by being a highlight reel KO artist. However, it's not only the women who gain a following through their good looks in Japanese MMA. And that is because I need to introduce to you the most popular fighter you have likely never heard of, Miura Kota. Miura Kota has by far the highest follower count on Instagram out of any of the fighters in Japanese MMA. Tetsuro Taira, 150,000. Koji Horiguchi, 330,000. Mikuru Asakura, 967,000. Miura Kota has 2.8 million. I repeat, 2.8 million followers on Instagram. Just for reference, Diego Lopez has 1 million. Tom Aspinall has 1.7 million. Brandon Moreno has 2.1 million. Merab Dvalishvili has 2.5 million. Justin Gaethje has 2.6 million. This pretty Japanese guy has more followers than not just UFC champions, but literal legends of the sport. And it is because he is extremely popular with Thai and Korean women for his very good looks. And his record as a fighter is 2-4, and he's currently on a 4-fight KO loss streak, with 3 of those KO losses coming against flyweights, even though Miura himself typically weighs in at 63 kilograms or 139 pounds. So Miura Kota is probably the world's most popular and famous fighter with a losing record. Personally, I want to see Miura Kota versus Death Sentence in Rizin at some point, but hey, that's just me. Anyways, moving on to the final fighter I want to talk about, it's King Edapolo. King Edapolo is a 6'8" or 204 centimeter heavyweight prospect who is currently training with Alex Pereira and his team. Although Edapolo was born to a Korean mother and a Nigerian father, he was born and raised in Japan and exclusively speaks Japanese, and also reps the Japanese flag as a fighter. While he is only 2-0, he is being developed as the future of the heavyweight division. And that's not at Rizin, which tried to create a heavyweight division through a tournament in 2025, which ended up flopping badly. No, King Edapolo will likely be going to fight in the UFC within the next 4 to 5 years. So just know that you heard about him here first. But anyways, those are all the fighters I wanted to talk about, or at least all of the ones I could afford to talk about given that this video is already set to be over an hour long. So let's end this video off by talking about some important officials and media personalities in the Japanese MMA scene. Part 4. Important officials and media personalities in Japanese MMA. There's only one man who is fit to be at the start of this section, and that is the former CEO of Pride Fighting Championships and the current CEO of Rizin, Nobuyuki Sakakibara. While I did go over some of his contributions to Japanese MMA during the history section of this video, I haven't gotten into why exactly Sakakibara is such a good MMA promoter, and probably the greatest promoter of MMA in the history of the sport. I mean, there's a very good reason why he was made to sign that 7-year non-compete with Zuffa, if you get what I mean. Sakakibara, who is also known as Jigoku no Promota, or the promoter from hell, makes sure at every step to prioritize spectacle and story over pure efficiency. Where Dana White will do an Instagram live to announce title fights, Sakakibara will go to Shinto Shrine in front of thousands of attendees to announce his fight cards, and even flies in some champions from overseas just for the sake of having them there to build hype. With the UFC, every event feels more or less the same, with the only major difference between cards being whether it's in the Apex or on the road. But with every Rizin card, there is something stylistically different. Whether it is the inclusion of rap and synth for the music of Super Rizin 3, or the use of traditional Japanese drums for Rizin no Tokomatsuri, or bringing in a whole ass orchestra to do a whole concert for the opening ceremony of the 2025 New Year's Eve show, Sakakibara understands that MMA isn't just a cage fight. It has to be accented and flavored with drama, music, art, and visual spectacle. And Sakakibara isn't afraid to put himself out there. I mean, could you imagine Dana White getting up in front of 40,000 people at the Tokyo Dome, going shirtless and only wearing his underwear, then announcing the start of the event? Sakakibara is the exact kind of man who you want to have running a fight promotion. He doesn't get overly angry when criticized like Dana White does, instead remaining calm and composed at all times. He is genuinely passionate about the sport, unlike Don Davis. And he does not hold fighters in contract hell like Charity Sityodong. I mean, Sakakibara literally let Yuri, Kai, and Kyoji all go to the UFC because they wanted to, even though they were some of his biggest stars. But anyways, that's enough glazing of President Nobu, because now I'm going to start glazing the Rizin matchmaker and translator, Shingo Kashiwagi. Mr. Kashiwagi, who is also known as Charlie in Japan, is Rizin's matchmaker and talent scout, and he is the very man you all have to thank for Yuri Prohaska and Manel Kape in the UFC, because it was Shingo's eye for talent that brought them into the public consciousness. Shingo Kashiwagi speaks perfect English and Japanese, and is in charge of negotiating contracts with managers and doing post-fight interviews. And then, the final person you need to know about is a guy called Hafid Darbaki. Hafid runs the English social media and broadcasting platform Verizon, and also does a few of the interviews with the fighters. But anyways, let's now move on to the media members. First, if you are at all interested in the nitty-gritty details about the Japanese MMA scene, I would highly recommend checking out a channel called Kakuto Cast, which you can find by typing out @KTCast in YouTube search. Shin, who is the guy who runs the show, speaks fluent Japanese and English, and recently has done a series of interviews with Kai Asakura's former coach, Billy Bigelow. If you want to learn more about how Japanese MMA works, I would highly recommend listening to these interviews because Billy Bigelow is a coach who had no prior experience with Japanese culture and was thrown straight into the deep end when he came to Japan to train Kai. Shin also runs a smaller, English-only channel called Fight Breakdowns with Arrows, albeit on there he mainly talks about boxers like Naoya Inoue and Junto Nakatani. Another channel I would recommend is the podcast called the We Are Rizin podcast, which I have been on a few times in the past. They exclusively cover Rizin and JMMA related topics, and if you made it to this point in the video, you should probably be able to understand what they are talking about, since without background knowledge, it could be very difficult to get into. But anyways, this section was bound to be shorter than the others, so let's just get to the conclusion at this point. To conclude this video, I just have to say that this video could have been 5 hours long if I wanted it to be, because while this video is the comprehensive guide to modern Japanese MMA, we have really only scratched the surface. There's plenty of other topics to cover, such as going over the other lesser-known Japanese UFC fighters, or talking about Manel Kape's Ryzen run, or discussing the leaked tape of Ryzen lightweight Yoshinari Horie. But this video is bloated already. So I just wanted to say thank you for listening up until this point, and yes, have a nice rest of your day. Goodbye.